With tensions that have been rising over trade, tariffs and Russia, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was in Delhi today to break the ice with Foreign Minister Jaishankar. In this getting to know each other meeting, both sides admitted there were differences that needed a resolution. Great friends are bound to have differences, Mr. Pompeo in fact remarked. India imposed retaliatory tariffs on 28 US items earlier this month after the Trump administration ended trade concessions for India on the 1st of June. That has been one of the most sticking issues between the two countries. Foreign Minister Jaishankar, however, made it clear also that India would be guided by its own national interest when it came to purchasing defense systems from Russia. The US wants India to forego the $5 billion S-400 missile defense system deal, which could invite American sanctions. But Mr. Jaishankar was clear that India would make its own decision.
There will be two questions.
Great friends are bound to have disagreements. The United States has been clear we seek greater market access and the removal of trade barriers in our economic relationship. And today I address these differences in the spirit of friendship, and I think that the two of us will be able to see a good outcome for each of our two countries. And we'll keep working to resolve any economic disputes, not only those that we have at this moment, but those that, when any significant trading relationship inevitably arise. Look, we've got to get this piece right, the economic piece right, because there are a myriad of opportunities.
We have many relationships with many countries. Many of them are of some standing. They have a history. So I think we will do what is in our national interest. We had a discussion on our defense cooperation. And the key point here is that if that is to continue to grow, it's important that we display trust and confidence in each other.
Meanwhile, just days after India reacted strongly to a US State Department report on religious freedom, which was very critical of India's track record, Mr. Pompeo, in a policy speech in Delhi this evening, suddenly talked about it, saying that it was important to stand up in defense of religious freedom for all. Listen in.
India is the birthplace of 4 major world religions. Let's stand up. Let's stand up together in defense of religious freedom for all. Let's speak out strongly together in favor of those rights. For whenever we do compromise those rights, the world is worse off.
Well, joining us tonight is Ambassador Jaishankar, who's of course India's former ambassador to the United States. Dhruv Jaishankar is with us here in the studio. He's a fellow at Brookings, India. Also with us from Washington via Skype is Sadanand Dhume. And I'll take my first question to you, Ambassador Jaishankar. What did you think about the overall optics of this trip? I mean, was this a trip essentially that Mike Pompeo undertook to kind of repair things which have been a bit frayed?
I think it's also a trip to re-engage with the new Indian government following the elections, since there is now a new government with a clear mandate. So it's a signal of a willingness to re-engage on all these issues which have been piling up in the relationship, while reiterating the overall importance of the relationship and the broad convergences. Now there are also issues which have accumulated both on the geostrategic side, for instance purchase of defense equipment from other countries, particularly the S-400 from Russia. Naturally, a country like India would not like to compromise its freedom of choice, because we pay with hard cash for the weapons that we buy, including from the United States. We don't take assistance. So obviously this is something which will be important for India going forward, to have the freedom of choice to choose whichever system from whichever country best suits its requirements, technically as well as cost-wise. Second is the question of Iran, whether there will be the situation will deteriorate into open conflict. Here I think India has kind of tried to meet the US halfway, because by stopping oil imports from Iran, while getting a carve out partially on Chabahar.
Are you saying then that these are going to still be difficult issues to wade through in the next few months?
Yes, because if there is, for instance, a war, if the situation, God forbid, degenerates from the rhetoric into actual conflict right now, then India is going to be badly impacted, because we have so many Indians in the Gulf.
Yeah,
the price
absolutely.
of oil will go up, our current account balance will be askew.
So
there are many implications, and naturally we don't want to see a conflict here.
Absolutely, or to see the situation degenerate. Just to get a view from Washington, Sadanand, an important thing Ambassador Jaishankar was saying there was, how India would want to retain its freedom of choice when it came particularly to, for purchasing defense equipment, for instance, from Russia. But does the Trump administration see things that way? We've seen the way Donald Trump deals with his own friends and allies. And are they willing to give India that space to be able to make those choices?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of jury is still out the S-400 deal. There is legislation that allows the president to give India a waiver. I think India would be confident when push comes to shove, that is what will happen. But I think there's also some wiggle room, because this is defined less in terms of when you buy it, when you actually pay for it. So I don't see this as something that is going to be resolved one way or another in the immediate future. To me, the thing that is more concerning about the long term, the economic side of it, because for the longest time, the U.S. position on trade with India was simply that we should grow the trade relationship. It's about $100 billion, and the idea was to get the relationship to reach about $500 billion. Very far from that goal. But one big difference, the Trump era, is that Trump has begun to focus obsessively, in my opinion, and incorrectly, on the deficit. Now, this, coupled with the fact that the Modi administration has reversed Indian trade, the first time really since 1991, India has been moving, away from steady, albeit slow, the trade liberalization. It's been putting in place new tariffs and so on. That the economic relationship is really the thing that the long term or in the medium term is going to continue to provide friction. A lot of the other stuff is just, it's perennially on the burner, some form or the other.
Right. And in fact, that's why Mike Pompeo actually said that we've got to get the economic piece right. And then everything else, in a sense, Dhruv Jaishankar, he seemed to suggest, would kind of, fall into place. And you agree with Sadanand that, in a sense, Donald Trump is obsessively focused on this trade deficit. And that could actually really create more friction in the days ahead.
No, I mean, Trump has been very clear about some things from the outset, even from the time he was a candidate for president. One of these is that, fixing the trade deficit with other countries, China being at the top of the list, but India certainly being on the list. That was one of them. Burden sharing being another one, and particularly with U.S. allies, but in India's case, he has brought it up in the context of Afghanistan. And so I think there have been some issues that Trump's instincts at least have been quite consistent, even if his temperament has varied. But, I think in India particularly, I think we tend to focus on all the problems in the relationship. And in the US, India doesn't feature as much in the national security consciousness. It is, and when it is thought of, it is usually thought of in more positive terms. So I think there is a little bit more obsessing over all of these differences that have been playing out, and they can't be papered over by any means over the last few months. What I think we have seen, at least, is a sort of positive tone set. I just came from Secretary of State Pompeo's speech, and he did try his best to convey a sort of positive tone for the relationship. He used he described the two countries being in an age of ambition, and he used that phrase at least 3 times over the course of his speech. But I think the downsides was, while he highlighted areas of convergence that have largely played in the US's favor, Iran, North Korea, a number of other issues, I think he missed an opportunity in some ways to sell what the US has to offer. And so in some ways I think
it fell short.
It fell short, certainly, I think, in communicating to an Indian audience, at least what the value of the US.
Well, we have Mr. Seshadri Chari, who's of course a very senior strategic affairs expert and a senior leader of the BJP as well, joining us. And Mr. Chari, one of the interesting comments of Mr. Pompeo today at the joint press conference with Mr. Jaishankar that stood out was right at the end, where he actually called Iran the world's largest state sponsor of terror and said that the Indian people have suffered from terror around the world. So I think there is a shared understanding of the threat and a common purpose to ensuring we keep energy at the right prices and deter this threat. Now, this was right at the end, and there was no opportunity really for the Indian foreign minister to kind of intervene or butt in any way. But, That's a statement that would certainly raise eyebrows. I mean, the way the US perceives Iran, the way India perceives Iran are, very, very different. And if I was to ask you whether this, along with trade, you think would be the two trickiest issues to deal with in the weeks ahead, and what would be the two positives, according to you?
Yeah, I think it's a very pertinent point. It was very unfortunate that he had to speak about Iran at the end of it. And we have made our stand as far as Iran is concerned very clear. We have told the Americans that, look, we would like to deal with Iran the way we want to deal with them. And we would also like to deal with Russia as far as our security and strategic matters are concerned. So we are not tied down to the American viewpoint as far as Iran is concerned. Not only that, we are also not tied down to the American viewpoint as far as NATO is concerned. So actually what is happening is probably the US wants in their grand design of NATO expanding its strategic outreach. And in that political and military orbit, they want India to be part of that NATO military and political orbit. I don't think we are neither in a position to accept this factor, nor we are actually inclined towards it. I am not speaking that there is no longer the kind of non-aligned movement that existed, and we are no longer non-aligned, but we have to maintain our neutrality. As far as we are able to not compromise with our neutrality, we should tell the Americans point blank that India's strategic security and energy security also depends on how we deal with whom and with whom we deal and how we deal. So we should not be looking neither at Iran, not even at China from the American prism. So we will have to tell the Americans that we are prepared to deal with you, and anyway we have got a Indo-US strategic partnership. But in spite of this strategic partnership, we have not gone very far. And just because they are offering us F-16, I don't think only for the sake of F-16 or some military army hardware, we cannot give up on our traditional neutral stand that we have taken as far as Iran is concerned. And we have showed the Americans how the kind of neutral stand that we took as far as Palestine is concerned.
No,
so we should tell them point blank,
from you there, Mr.
these are
Chari.
some of the red lines that the US cannot cross.
And I think that was also pretty clear in the way India, for
Pardon?
instance, has. I said it also seems exactly what India is following as far as, for instance, Russia is concerned. The Indian red lines are clear on that. And as Ambassador Jaishankar said, we may have met them halfway on Iran. But clearly, India has articulated its concerns very strongly, which is why that statement of Mr. Pompeo at the end on Iran was a bit of a surprise. Jyoti Malhotra was at that press conference with me today, and Jyoti, just one of the other things that could now really become contentious, and I'm sorry, Dhruv, that we focus on the negatives, but this is a problem. This whole buzz that Washington could now look at starting an investigation into unfair trade, what they see as unfair trade practices by India. That could elevate this whole trade war, this whole battle with India to another level. And there is a very real danger that it could happen. Is there a way that India can meet Trump halfway on this issue at all?
Nidhi, I think, I'm not sure that the negative aspect is going to be the dominant motive of the Indo-US relationship. I think, let's be very clear, Prime Minister Modi, even though he doesn't have a very good relationship with the US President Donald Trump, but I think he wants to make the India-US relationship a success. Now, in the past couple of years, we've seen that it's not a success, but he is clearly wants something to come out of it. And I think this mini trade war that we're talking about, somebody has to give. I think the Indians will give. We will give on the data localization, the sovereignty issues on data. I think we will give on the draft e-commerce policy, because that is clearly something that will not only that investors will not only shy away from, but run away from. And that's clearly something that Modi doesn't want. His whole thing about brand Modi is that India becomes a regional power, at least on par with other powers. So I think there will be some give on trade, there will be some give on commerce type of issues. But, and I'm not sure what happened on the Iran question that you just asked because I couldn't hear, but clearly the Indians have given in, within quotes, on Iran oil. We have stopped buying oil from Iran. India also did this in 2012. The last time around, the Americans slapped sanctions on Iran. So it's not as if this is the first time that the Indian government has not, has sort of capitulated on the Americans. I think what the Indians will not be pressurized about is the Russian S-400 deal. And I think that was very clear with what the Foreign Minister, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar said today.
Well, just to ask Ambassador Meera Shankar then on, the other thing that also stood out this evening at the speech that Dhruv Jaishankar was at was just days after India raised, its annoyance and with the State Department report on religious freedom, which was very critical of India. You have Secretary Pompeo talking about religious freedom for all. India is the birthplace of 4 major world religions. Let's speak in favor of the rights for whenever we do compromise, the world is worse off. It is quite a statement to make just days after India has diplomatically raised objections to the US commenting on India's internal matters.
I think it's driven largely by the conservative Christian constituency, which is a very core constituency for Trump. And many of them have expressed concerns, not just now, also previously, about, for instance, when you had the Staines murder or you had other issues or attacks on churches. So this is a constituency which Trump would like to appeal to. And I think that's many of the people in Congress would raise these issues with me with this in mind. So we have to keep in mind that partly he's addressing his constituency back home when he's raising the issue.
Sadanand, do you agree with that? Is it that, or is there more to it? Because the State Department report, talked about the sort of cow vigilante killings in India, etc. Do you think it's more than just a comment on, directed at his domestic audience?
I don't think this is just a Trump administration thing. This is just a constant. If you go back to Obama's speeches,
Obama did it.
This is just something that in the U.S. administration, the U.S. has a particular view of religious freedom. This is something that cuts across parties. And it would have been quite surprising if he had not mentioned it. I think we in the media in India are sort of focusing too much on it. It was just one small part of a speech. And, coming back to sort of point Dhruva made, I think the issue really is that our framing of the US-India relationship in India really remain in some ways stuck in the past, right? This language of capitulation and we will not give in and we will stand ground. And I think we still haven't evolved in sort of seeing this just as it's an important but a normal relationship with some give and take. There are things that the US steps out to do for India, for example, on the Masood Azhar issue or to get India into the NSG. And there are other areas where US. And this sort of thread that runs through the way we discuss it in terms of, but as though India has to prove that its sovereignty is intact, instead of taking for granted the fact that after 70 years, India is a sovereign country. Everybody knows that. That's how everyone deals with it.
So Dhruv Jaishankar, quick last comments from everyone. What would you say would be the points where there could be a halfway meeting point then, in the next few months? These are going to be critical. The Prime Minister meets President Trump in a couple of days in Japan. Where do you think we could meet each other halfway?
Well, I think every outstanding issue, there is a possibility for a resolution. I don't think these are intractable problems. I'm not saying that will happen, and there is certainly a risk, and I would be most worried about trade issues in particular spiraling a little out of control. But there's certainly room for agreement on almost every issue. The question is, can both sides do it? I think one of the changes, and I think Saddam was right to point this out, is that India is able to also engage with the US with a great deal more confidence, and is also very clear about its red lines. I think on the S-400 it has made its position quite clear. On certain trade issues, I think India has made intellectual property and other things. India has made its position quite clear. On other issues, there's much more room for give and take. and the US also again has its own red lines that India has also acknowledged. So I think every issue is resolvable. The question is, can the two sides find an accommodation on this basket of issues ranging from Russia and Iran to Afghanistan to trade?
Mr. Chari, you think the US needs to mind its own business on religious freedom issues?
No, I think, see, just as this government has pointed out the fallacy of this report, the earlier government, the UPA government under Dr. Manmohan Singh also faced the same situation, and even then, in spite of Dr. Manmohan Singh being a great votary of Indo-US nuclear deal, they pointed out these issues, and Dr. Manmohan Singh government also said to the US the same thing, that these are all internal issues, and I think United States should not be pointing it out. Even at that time, we had also pointed out that in spite of what China does as far as the occupied areas in Tibet is concerned, nobody raises any issue about it. The US never pointed out anything about Pakistan, only about India. If they are going to point out these things, they are not really going to do any great service to Indo-US relationship as such. But we are not worried about this, because even the half of the Americans are not very serious about the issues that the State Department has taken out. Moreover, this report is not part of the American government, but it is part of a small caucus which functions, as Ambassador Jaishankar very rightly pointed out. They have their own internal political dynamics to which they are playing out. So I am not worried much about it. And I am also not worried about the possible change of government. Whether it changes or not, whether Trump's comes back or not is not important, because if you see the amendments to Arms Control Export Act the bill has been introduced. This bill has been introduced by two senators. One is Mark Warner, who is a Democrat, and one John Cornyn, who is a Republican. So both Democrats and Republicans are on the same page as far as coming to terms with India's rise in the world affairs are concerned. So that is the silver lining, and we should take this opportunity. But we should be also very careful in one thing. We should not be drawn into the war games that the US wants to play. Trade is very important for us, and given US-China trade war, we should be able to benefit out of that maximum, and that is what Prime Minister Narendra Modi should impress upon when he meets Trump.
Mr. Trump.
In
Sadanand,
Osaka.
you disagreed with something Mr. Chari said.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Quick factual correction. This is not some report that specially singles out India. The US has been extensively about Tibet, even about the Chinese mistreatment of Uyghurs, talked about Pakistan and the MPs. This is a State Department report that covers the entire world. As a factual matter, Mr. Chari is not to say that it is unfairly singling out.
All right. Well, let's see how the two countries are able to perhaps try and resolve these issues over the next few weeks and months. They should be interesting. Thank you to all of you for joining us for some perspective on that important relationship there.